I think some of you may know that Helen is a seasoned and experienced journalist. She's written for The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, New York Magazine, Harper's Bazaar, and Slate. Soldier Girls is her second book. And I suspect that many of you have by now also seen the excellent reviews of Soldier Girls. I think the one that is the hardest to come by, you have come by, which is the Michiko Kakutani in the New York Times, who raved about the book. That's really an accomplishment. We know from all the books that we read, and then we see what she has to say about them. Helen's also been on television on NPR. She was on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And there are many, many reasons that this book is getting so much attention. For one, it explores issues with far-reaching consequences for our country, issues that are too often relegated to the margins of our national political discourse. What are the real costs and benefits of a volunteer military? What is the purpose and appropriate role of the National Guard? And frankly, we don't have to look even beyond our own borders right now to be thinking about that question. And of course, the main issue that she focuses on in this book, what have America's most recent engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq meant to the lives of women who, in growing numbers, are being deployed to help wage America's war on terror? Helen is a meticulous reporter, and if you read this book or her previous book, you'll also know that she is a careful and caring writer. To the task of researching and writing this book, she brought her keen eye as a journalist and her perspective as a woman who knew what it meant to have dreams of one's own, who knew firsthand the challenge of balancing work and family, and who understood how and why the experiences of three otherwise ordinary and unremarkable women from Indiana would and should resonate with a wider audience. In the end, this book reminds us of the chasm between political decisions and the lives they affect. And of course, Soldier Girls also offers an unflinching portrait of the human consequences of war. I'm up here all the time introducing books, and so I really honestly don't say this lightly. This is really an important book, and it's a really, really good book. So I urge you all to read it. If you haven't yet, I urge you to encourage others to read it. It does need to be part of our discourse, and she's done such a fabulous job of bringing these stories to the fore. So please join me in welcoming Helen Thorpe to Politics and Prose.
Hi, it is so nice to be here. I've had a whole bunch of surprises this evening, wonderful surprises, but walking in and seeing my best friend from high school sitting here, not knowing she was going to be here, tops it off with her family. So it's amazing to see you guys. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, which was quite incredible. So let me tell you a little bit about this book, and there are three main characters in the book. So I'll also read a little bit about one paragraph about each of those women. And then I'll do another really short reading that gives you a sense of them interacting with each other. And then I'd really like to make this evening mostly about a conversation with you, and we can do lots of questions. So I'll time myself to make sure I don't talk for way too long all by myself. Okay. So this book tells the story of three really different women who all happen to serve at the same time in the Indiana National Guard. And so they had signed up imagining they were going to be part-time soldiers, 1 weekend a month or 2 weeks and 2 weeks in the summer when they would do annual training. And instead, after they had already enlisted, 9/11 happened, and so their lives turned out to be really different than what they had originally envisioned. So the three women are, there's 30 years difference in age from youngest to oldest, and there's about that much difference in terms of their political beliefs. And I want to give you just a little sense of each one of those women. So Michelle, the book opens with Michelle, and she's the youngest of the three. And she, in the fall of 2000, votes for Ralph Nader. And then in the spring of 2001, she enlists in the military, in the National Guard. So let's see why she might do that, given that not everybody who votes for Ralph Nader turns around and becomes a soldier. In the fall of 2000, Michelle had enrolled at the University of Southern Indiana, a commuter college that squatted beside the Lloyd Expressway to the west of the National Guard Armory. She had borrowed the maximum possible amount in student loans as she was paying her entire tuition bill by herself. As she began her college career, Michelle was sharing a one-bedroom apartment with her mother, working as a waitress at a steakhouse called the Golden Corral, and driving back and forth to classes in the tank. That's what she named her 1994 silver Ford Tempo. It had been a gift from her father. A burly wreck of a man, he loved Michelle dearly, but he had never stuck with any of his 4 wives, nor had he safeguarded the economic well-being of his children. He had bought the car used for $2,000 and given it to Michelle in lieu of paying the $40,000 in child support that he owed to her mother. Michelle's mother eked out a thin existence with occasional welfare checks, irregular jobs, regular packs of Marlboro Lights, and a steady supply of double cola. After he bought the car for Michelle, her father asked her mother to sign a letter saying she wouldn't sue him for the money that he owed, and then he had handed Michelle the keys. She liked to joke that she drove a $40,000 beater. The joke encapsulated everything about her childhood, what she'd been given, what her parents had failed to provide, and the spark that let her laugh about it all, especially the parts that were not really funny. Michelle remembers the military recruiters who came to her high school, and she's thinking she would really like to go to Indiana University, to a college where she could live on campus and live in a dorm, and that she wouldn't have to be a waitress anymore. So in the spring, she enlists to try to make those dreams come true. And she knows she's politically out of step with most of the people that she's going to be working alongside in the Guard, but she figures she can get through that 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer, and it won't be a big deal. When later on she winds up deploying to Afghanistan, she becomes really close friends with another woman, and this is somebody who, in that same election back in 2000, had voted for George Bush and supported the war in Afghanistan wholeheartedly, unlike Michelle. And they lived together in a tent during their time in Afghanistan, Camp Phoenix in Kabul. And they are drawn to each other as the two troublemakers in their tent. Michelle is angry to find herself in Afghanistan because she opposes that war. Desma supports the war, but she's a single mother with 3 children, and she's had to leave her children at home. And she only had a matter of weeks to figure out where they were going to live. And she's just emotionally discombobulated with this separation from her children, and she's acting out. So I'm going to read a little passage about Desma. Desma is a pretty amazing person. She's highly intelligent. She reads all the time. She also dropped out of high school at 15 and got pregnant at 16 and had her first child at 17, and then took the GED and scored in the top 10% in her state because she's so smart, and then enlisted in the National Guard at age 20. And it was an extra paycheck for her. And otherwise, she's making money at this truck stop. And I'll read to you about the truck stop where she works. And you kind of get a sense of her very vivid personality here, too. At the truck stop, Desma learned how to carry a big tray and joshed amiably with the regulars. Steel haulers stopped by for dinner, killing time as they waited for their rigs to be loaded at AK Steel's cold mill facility down beside the Ohio. It produced the widest steel sheet in North America. Other drivers ate lunch while their rigs were loaded with shiny rolls of aluminum over at the Alcoa smelting facility. Desma also got to know the truckers who worked for Heartland Express, an Indiana-based trucking company. She knew the drivers by their CB handles. Bonehauler carried steel. Old Man worked for Heartland Express. Scatterbrain and Outlaw did repo work, confiscating rigs from owner-operators who couldn't make their payments. Desma met Jimmy on a cold night in November 2002. He delivered brand new rigs to truckers all over the states of Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Jimmy sat down at one of Desma's tables with a group that was telling jokes that got dirtier as the sky darkened. Jimmy grew chagrined after spotting a plastic bracelet on Desma's wrist that said, "What would Jesus do?" He assumed the waitress was church-going and said they better stop telling such bad jokes or they were going to offend her. "What screws like a tiger and winks?" asked Desma. "What?" said Jimmy. "Roar," said Desma and winked. So that's Desma. So she's the most colorful person in the tent, and Michelle's drawn to her because she makes the time in Afghanistan go easier by telling jokes and being outrageous and ordering 50 pink plastic flamingos to put around their tent and brighten up their otherwise kind of monochromatic army green surroundings. In Afghanistan, Michelle also works with a woman who's 30 years older than she is, a woman named Debbie Helton. And Debbie is just go Army all the way. Her father was a drill sergeant. She had always wanted to belong to the military. She views the deployment to Afghanistan as the highlight of her life, no question. She's a beautician when she's back in Indiana. She does waxing and electrolysis, and she starts cutting hair when they're deployed together in Afghanistan for some of the young women in Michelle and Desma's tent. And Michelle and Debbie work together on the armament team. They're both weapons mechanics. So I want to just read a little bit about Debbie in the days when the unit has just they're in the 113th Support Battalion, and their battalion has gotten orders to go to Afghanistan. And this is Debbie, who all she's worried about is whether she's going to get to go. She just really, really wants to go. And this is before she gets close to Michelle. So, okay. All that concerned Debbie was whether the doctors would find her fit enough. At 51, she was the oldest woman in Bravo Company, and she had to make it through a screening designed to weed out individuals with mental or physical impairments. Debbie, to her great joy, was cleared to go. Then Bravo Company's executive officer, they called him the XO, pulled her aside. "You aren't going to Afghanistan," he said. "You're a stay-back." "Why?" asked Debbie. "We already have enough people on the team," he told her. She was supposed to be joining a 4-person team led by ex-Marine Patrick Miller that would handle armament. That meant fixing broken weapons for the most part. But the XO said that team might travel off-post, might accidentally see combat. "It's probably going to be an all-male team," he told her. "I'd really, really like to go," Debbie said. But he didn't relent, and Debbie went home crestfallen. The Guard was the center of her life, and now the rest of her colleagues were going without her. Maybe the XO had been trying to protect her, or maybe he thought she was past her prime. Jeff, this is her partner, had never seen Debbie so disconsolate. Then Debbie heard that 2 45Bs, well, they're calling each other 45 Bravos, and here it looks like 45B in the book, and that's the designation for a small weapons mechanic. Then Debbie heard that 2 45 Bravos from Evansville were joining the armament team. That had to mean Schmidt and Michelle Fisher. They were the only 2 45 Bravos in Evansville. How did Michelle Fisher gain a spot on the supposedly all-male team? "I'm a little upset," she told the XO the following month. "Didn't you indicate it was going to be all guys for armament? And the job they were doing, there weren't going to be any females?" "Yes." "Well, then how come Fisher's on it?" What makes you think Fisher's on it? I know she's on it. And last time I checked, she was a female. How come she gets to go? So you have these women who have such different feelings about the person who's their commander-in-chief at that moment in time, and such different feelings about the idea of military service, and such different feelings about even the idea of going to Afghanistan. And you get to watch them deploy together, and actually their differences you soon see will not matter nearly as much once they're overseas as they do at home, because what starts to matter more is what are they like to get along with, who has what kind of sense of humor, who's going to make the days go easier, what are they like to live with in a tent where there's 10 women sleeping in one tent. So everything kind of shifts when they get deployed, and they form really lifelong alliances when they're there. I'm going to read one more really short, it's about 2 pages, section that shows how Michelle, the youngest, and Desma, who's the colorful single mom with 3 kids, how they kind of bond, how they get close. And this takes place in the days right before they actually get on the plane to go to Afghanistan. And they've been training. They're at Camp Atterbury in Indiana. They're living on an army base. It's as if they're full-time active duty. They're on active duty now, so it's as if they're in the regular army, even though they had intended to sign up to be part-time soldiers. They're very much living a full-time soldier's life. They're still getting used to that, and in the days right before they deploy, everybody goes a little bit crazy, and like a lot of strange things happen right before the deployment. So this is how Desma decides she's going to help this young woman, Michelle, get ready to go to war. At the end of July, right before they had to board the airplane, they snuck off post together. It was Desma who coined the idea to go to the Classy Chassis, a strip club with an Indy 500 race car theme. Their departure was looming, and they were desperate for distraction. Desma rounded up people she thought needed to be shown a good time and herded them into her Vista Cruiser, a vast station wagon with paneled siding and a floaty ride. It was the middle of the week, and they had no permission to leave post. What the hell, Desma figured. The advance party had already left, and pretty soon they were all going to be in a war zone. It seemed like a good idea to go AWOL now, while they were still surrounded by the forgiving cornfields of Indiana, which lit up every night with galaxies of fireflies. She said she would be the designated driver. Mary Bell sat beside Desma in the passenger seat, dressed in a pink tube top and a white tennis skirt. Behind them, on the wagon's middle bench seat, were Michelle Fisher and her perpetual shadow, muscular, tattooed Ben Sawyer. This is a guy who's married, but in a relationship with a wife who he's telling people possibly suffering from addiction and substance abuse issues, and he is unhappily married, is what he's telling others. And he has kind of attached himself to Michelle. Michelle claimed that they were just friends, but it looked like more than that to Desma. On the rear-facing back seat sat Susie Allen and Don Southard. A devout Christian, Susie had been leading a wholesome life on post, despite the debauchery going on around her, but Desma had grabbed her anyway, figuring she had to be freaked out too. Ben Sawyer had persuaded Don Southard to join them on the way to the car. He was a good-looking married man who was fond of boxing. The Classy Chassis was hopping. Drag cars hung from the ceiling, lit up by red neon, while black lights sucked the color out of everything in the room, except the white parts of the strippers' costumes. One stripper was dressed as a cowgirl, another as Captain America. They saw other soldiers in the audience, but they were the only women. The DJ fanned the crowd into a frenzy when he played Whip It, And then Michelle requested Def Leppard's Pour Some Sugar on Me. The strippers lavished attention on them, delighted to be entertaining women. Desma stuck to her promise and ordered only Diet Cokes, but she harassed the bartender into making stiff drinks for her friends. "Listen, we didn't drive all the way down here to drink juice and water," Desma told him. "If I wanted them to drink juice and water, I could have kept them at home." They got so rowdy that the manager told them they were going to have to leave unless they settled down. They were quiet for a while, but then a particularly attractive stripper came over and made purring sounds in their ears. She put her head down between Susie's legs and vaulted upward into a headstand. Her tiny white underpants glowed under the club's black lights. "Oh my goodness," exclaimed Susie. "I need to get in the car," Mary announced. Desma told the others she was going to take Mary outside. They walked around the parking lot until Mary felt better, and then Desma got her into the Vista Cruiser and rolled down her window and told her, "Do not puke in the car." The others finally emerged, and Desma got them onto 465, the highway that looped around Indianapolis. "I don't feel good," Mary said. "You need to tell me before you're going to vomit so I can pull over," Desma instructed. "Okay," Mary said. But the car had that floaty ride. Desma looked into the rearview mirror for a moment and saw that Ben Sawyer had his arm all the way around Michelle and was holding his hand over her mouth to keep her quiet while she was shaking with laughter. Behind them, Desma saw 2 feet up by the roof of the car. Were those Susie's feet? Then Mary made a little sound like a meow. "Did you just puke in my car?" Desma cried. "No, in my tube top," Mary reported. "I know you got napkins," said Ben Sawyer. "You're a mom." They could not clean Mary up sufficiently with the car moving floatily along at 60 miles an hour, so Desma pulled off onto the shoulder of the highway. Mary stumbled out of the car, pulled off her tube top, and flung it into the darkness. Desma and Michelle were mopping her puke-stained breasts when another vehicle pulled up behind them. It was the company commander. Mueller and his second-in-command just sat in their van, taking it all in. "Oh, Mary, your boobies!" cried Michelle. She stepped behind Mary and cupped her friend's naked breasts in her hands. They stood like that, looking at the 2 leaders of their unit, as Don Southard and Susie Allen pulled on their clothes and stumbled out of the car. Alcohol-induced stupidity, Susie Allen would say later, but she wasn't sober yet, and she was looking at her commander. Desma stepped forward and observed tartly she believed the company's 2 leaders were AWOL. "You're not supposed to leave the post," she announced. "What are you doing on this highway?" Mueller sighed. He asked if she was sober enough to drive and told them, "Go back to Camp Atterbury." Desma bumped into Mueller the next morning. "How's everybody feeling?" he asked dryly. "We're feeling just fine," Desma told him. "Where did you go?" "We went to the Red Door." "Where did you go?" "We went to the Classy Chassis." "That's why everybody was puking in your car," he said. "Oh, not everybody was puking," said Desma. They left for Afghanistan the following day. I'm going to stop there. And I mean, the book does go forward for another 10 years from that, from not 9 years from that point in time. And to just very quickly sketch the arc that it goes through, you see these women go to Afghanistan and come back and struggle to regain their civilian lives. And then their unit gets orders to go to Iraq. Michelle has just opted not to re-enlist, and she does not go, but Debbie and Desma do go to Iraq. And then you see them really struggle to come back from the second deployment, which is much harder than the first. And Desma does return with post-traumatic stress disorder, and she shared with me her therapy notes and her VA file and even some tape recordings that she and her therapist made for therapy purposes. And you see her really work hard to try to learn how to relax again in a civilian environment, and it's a huge struggle for her. So the book has funny parts, but also heavier parts and more serious parts too. But hopefully it's a way for people to get a really good understanding of what these women lived through in their 2 deployments and their struggles to come back home. And it is full of their amazing resilience and humor and their liveliness too. So it's a full of life, I think, as well as something that deals with subjects that can be hard. But I want to talk about what you want to talk about. So I want to turn it over now to questions and answers. Any questions?
How did you pick those 3?
So let me ask, do people need to come up to a microphone? Okay. Okay, so how did I pick these 3 women? I was interviewing different veterans who were coming back, and I interviewed people who'd been in different branches of the military, men and women, but these women leapt out at me as people who had really, really strong personalities and strong voices, who could really articulate a lot of the emotional experience that they went through. And they each had, Michelle had an unbelievable ability to remember telling details. So a lot of these things are things that she can remember, and not everybody has that kind of memory. Desma had all of these therapy notes and medical records that she was willing to share. And Debbie had kept 6 diaries throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. So they had, and Michelle had written letters that her father and her boyfriend had kept too. So they just had like a wealth of documentary evidence that they were able to share, which kind of let me capture their voices loud and clear. And that was one of the main reasons. Yeah. Let's go here and then here.
Okay. Well, you've answered part of my question. I wanted a little more background on how you happened to pick the subject, why Indiana.
Right.
And
so, yeah, Indiana is why Indiana is an interesting question because I don't live in Indiana. I actually live in Denver, Colorado, and toward the end of this book, you see Michelle move to Colorado, where she finds the progressive veterans community. And you can tell that Debbie and Desma fit more comfortably into the traditional veterans community. But Michelle struggles in the veterans community, and she struggles in the progressive community. She struggles in the veterans community because they don't understand the way she votes or her political beliefs, and she struggles in the progressive community because sometimes they don't understand why she would be a veteran or why she would have served or why she fell in love with Afghanistan and why she had a positive experience there. And so only when she finds the progressive veteran community that she finds in Colorado does she sort of feel at home. And you see all that kind of happen in the book. And she and I met in Colorado kind of through the progressive veterans community there.
So was meeting her what gave you the idea?
Meeting her was how I started on this journey. And she then introduced me to Debbie and Desma, her 2 closest friends in the Guard, who were still back in Indiana. And I would go to Indiana every month for a couple of years and interview them there. And I would interview Michelle in Denver, where I live. And some of our interviews were actually all together, and those were amazing. So they were marathon interviews. They would go for hours because they would start reminding each other, and they would get out their laptop computers and start pulling out photographs and telling stories. And it was really hard to keep up. I was, trying to write it all down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Helen.
This is my former colleague from Texas Monthly, Robert Draper, who now writes for the New York Times Magazine. And we have the same editor at Scribner, and he is an incredible writer that I've looked up to for a long time.
Thank you, Helen.
So.
I'll sit down now.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful scene that you read from, and it also shows the company commander in this very sympathetic and sympathizing light, albeit, of the weary kind perhaps. But I suspect that, of course, that's the night before deployment, and I suspect that for these women, their experiences were different in this male-dominated institution once they were over there. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we see them, talking amongst each other, and they're in a relationship, but how were they amongst their, male superiors and male colleagues?
So thank you for asking that question. One of the great things about having three different women to write about is that you get kind of multiple vantage points on something like the question that you're asking. So the experience was different for each of them. Michelle, the youngest, was 21 when they were in Afghanistan that year. And she's a very physically attractive young woman at that time. She still is. She had long, blonde, curly hair. She's very curvy. And she just was relentlessly pursued from the moment she left her tent till the moment she got back, all day long. And she found it really, really wearying. She was not ever assaulted in all the time she was in the military, but she describes very vividly the kind of attention that she was constantly attracting and how uncomfortable it was for her. Debbie Helton, 30 years older than Michelle, is actually looking on somewhat wistfully thinking, wow, it's a long time since I got that kind of attention. And Debbie never struggled in the military to feel that she belonged or that she fit in the way that Michelle did. And Debbie had always prided herself on just being one of the guys. And when the guys would make crude jokes, she would make a crude joke right back. And she felt really proud of her ability to do that. And so you see each of them feeling very differently about what it's like to be in this male-dominated culture. Debbie would say, I loved it. And Michelle would say, I found it really, really hard. Desma was assaulted by a recruiter when she was signing up. She was not assaulted overseas, but toward the end of the book, you see her be transferred when her National Guard unit is broken apart, and she becomes what she calls a filler. So she's transferred into a previously all-male infantry regiment. Her experience is so uncomfortable. The men are so unfriendly. She requests to transfer out, and she's transferred into a formerly all-male field artillery regiment. There's just a handful of women, hundreds of men in this regiment, but they're more welcoming than the infantry soldiers were. And she does spend the year in Afghanistan in that kind of gender ratio. And watching that happen in the book is really, I think, a fascinating thing, because she's a single mom with 3 kids. This is her second deployment. She was trained to do a desk job. Now she's told, drive a gun truck out on the highways of Iraq, look for roadside bombs. And by the way, almost every one of your colleagues is going to be a guy, and they're not used to working with women. It was a pretty intense experience. I think she's proud that she survived it. She made lifelong friends with some of the men in that second formerly all-male unit, where she got a warm reception. And she has some critical things to say about the infantry soldiers who were not welcoming to her. So she had 2 really different experiences on 2 different occasions. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you followed these women for such a long time, clearly, I was wondering, is there, and obviously the fact of women starting, now to really face upfront, frontline type of, a quasi-frontline type of activity in the war, I was wondering, has there been any research done in the last years because you talk about one of these women having PTSD, obviously. The idea is that maybe 30% or more of men come back with PTSD, right? Has there been any research to figure out if these type of activities, the differential impact of these activities on men or women, or they are not, and also a woman coming back with this PTSD, when she come back, did she feel that they had the services available, the sensitivity available within it for, you know, our women with her special experiences with PTSD and readjustment, et cetera, et cetera.
So I'm kind of skipping over some major dramatic things that happen in the book because I don't want to spoil the book for you. And I think the whole question of what happens to Desma in Iraq is something that I want to leave for you as readers to be surprised by. But she does come home with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I do get into in the book some of the studies that have looked at what makes one soldier develop PTSD and when somebody else might have the identical experience but might not have that type of response to it. So I talk about that a little bit. I did not see studies that compared the responses of men versus women. I think that's an excellent question and would be fascinating to look at. But another thing that I do get into is what happens with Desma's children. And again, I kind of don't want to spoil the book for you, so I'll let you read it to find out. But her 3 children living through the 2 deployments. Towards the end of the book, we spend time watching her try to get them back on track, and some dramatic things happen in their lives too. So there's also the children who are affected as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I read the book. It's fantastic.
Oh, thanks.
And I had it on my Nook. But a couple of just quick questions.
Yeah.
One is incredible the way you deal with class and in terms of who enlists in the National Guard and the relationship of class in our society and how it affected the 3 women that you selected. And the second deals with they enlisted in the National Guard the way many did before September 11th. How now what's happened with the National, have you followed up what's happened with recruitment with the National Guard once it's realizing that it's a 6-year commitment that could mean active duty and might mean that?
Yeah.
I just wondered how that has impacted, as well as the role of women in the National Guard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You see over the course of the book, the National Guard repeatedly increasing the amount of the signing bonuses that it's willing to offer to people who will enlist as the war in Iraq starts to take longer than people thought and gets more complicated, and then the war in Afghanistan starts to get complicated as well, and it's going on, and they have to keep upping the signing bonuses in order to get more people to enlist. But they also as you see in the book, put their existing soldiers in the position of having to do these repeat deployments, the multiple deployments, which is really unprecedented. I mean, in Vietnam, people went once and they didn't have to go again unless they volunteered to go and said, I want to go back. So these multiple deployments are a big shift, and part of the reason that you see people coming back with traumatic experiences. And I'm a little bit digressing from your exact question, but I had an interesting experience today where I met with some people who run the GI rights hotline, and they were saying that many of the phone calls they get are from soldiers who are in the Guard or another branch of the military who come back, have PTSD, and then the military starts to treat them as a problem, and they're almost getting kicked out on and treated as if, their problems are their own, not something that the military helped create. And Desma does go through that experience, and I obviously knew that Desma went through that experience, but what I was learning was that this is the #1 issue in the phone calls they're getting on their hotline, and that it's a really common experience. And I hadn't seen any numbers on that. I didn't realize that this was a very common experience that veterans were facing, that even within the military, when they have PTSD, they're not well understood and are having this kind of issue that Desma has where, she gets her weapon taken away and she's treated like as if she's a problem within her own unit. So I'm sorry, I got a little bit afield of the question that you were asking.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I was just the role of class.
Yes, the role of class. Thank you. So I really wanted to write about the motivations that led these women to sign up. And I tried to do it in a way where I would, like in Desma's case, I would mention what her house payments were and what she was making at the truck stop. And then when you see the size of the signing bonus that the National Guard is offering, I think you can really feel her, the temptation that it represents, her eagerness to get that check. You can see why she's thinking, yeah, I can do 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer. That's a commitment I could make to get that bonus. They were really caught off, everybody was surprised by 9/11, obviously, but they didn't really understand that they could be sent overseas. Certainly it had happened before that the Guard had been sent overseas, but when they were signing up, they didn't know that could happen to them individually. And so it really was a decade that represented a really different commitment than what they thought they were making. And they each respond to that differently in their own way. And at the end of the book, you also see them respond really differently to the idea of women being allowed in full combat. They, again, have 3 super different opinions on that. And yet are lifelong friends. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for a couple more questions? Yeah. Hi.
I was interested, you talked at length about how they helped you get the material for the book. Did you show them drafts of what you were doing in the process of writing it, or not?
That's a great question. So, as a journalist, I've been trained that you're not allowed to show drafts to people that you're writing about. And this is very strict rule in newsrooms. And even people will be fired from newspapers for showing a draft to somebody that they're writing about. But I thought I really needed to show them a draft for many reasons. One was that they were sharing so much with me. They were sharing love letters they'd written. They were sharing diaries. And in Debbie's case, she was writing about her dependence on alcohol. Desma was sharing therapy notes. It was very, very intimate material. So I really wanted them to understand, do you realize this is all ending up in a book? Because everybody's going to read it, and how are you going to feel about that? Also, it's really hard as a civilian to get it right in writing about the military, because it's a culture unto itself, and if you haven't served yourself, it's all too easy to get the lingo wrong, or call the company commander a battalion commander by mistake, or there would be any number of small errors you could make. And I had not been to Iraq or Afghanistan, so I thought, just as a fact-checking exercise, it would be critical that they read this and say, this is accurate, or actually on page 352 you make this mistake. But I had to go get permission from my editor. I had to talk to a lawyer at the publishing house. I had to get the women, I had to write to them in writing and say, I have authorial control and I'm showing this to you and I'm interested in your feedback, but I will decide what goes in the book. And I had to jump through these hoops to make my publisher comfortable with me sharing the draft, because it is kind of unusual to do it. But I thought it was just the right thing to do. And in each case, actually, the women felt protective of somebody else in their lives. So they said, yep, that's me. I did all those things and those are my letters, but I really regret telling you this one weird habit that my boyfriend had. Or in Debbie's case, I really regret saying a few things about my daughter that she would feel were too revealing. Could you take those out? And I did take out that material that made them uncomfortable, because it wasn't about the main characters. It wasn't central, to the story. And I didn't think it was my job to cause discomfort to family members, or, so it was fine to remove it. And of course they did catch some mistakes I made as a civilian writing about the military that I really needed their help, to be more accurate. So, yeah, thanks. Hi.
I also read the book and just could not put it down, so thank you so much for a really amazing story. So I've read many books about men in wars, and their friendship bonds are formed very differently, and I was fascinated by the friendship that these three women formed, and I wondered if you thought it was because there were so few women and that was part of the reason for their bond, or whether it was just a particularly kind of female way that we form friendships, because I could see it both ways, but I was just curious why you thought they formed that intense bond.
I think both of those things are true. I think there were relatively few women, and so female friendships became like a form of relief from this otherwise very male environment. I think that also the way that women relate to each other, I think in war zones, things are often, you see things kind of in extreme, and so it's like female friendship in an extreme situation and almost in an extreme form. The communal living inside this tent where both Desma and Michelle are living, those women in that tent start ordering fancy underwear from Victoria's Secret because they're wearing this uniform. They feel ugly and they want to wear this fancy underwear. And you could tell they're kind of doing it as much to impress each other as they are anybody else who might see what's on underneath their uniform. For Debbie, I think she adopted every young woman in that tent, and you see one young woman coming to her later who's gotten herself in trouble with an infantry soldier, and a very intimate conversation between them. I think all these young women were turning to Debbie as a maternal figure. She became like mom to them all. I just think over there, when they were occasionally worried for their lives with alarm sounding and rocket-propelled grenades coming in their direction, that they formed a kind of an alternate family with each other, like sisters or like mothers and daughters. That's very intense. And I think one of the reasons they actually wanted to do the book project was we could all get together and they could relive some of their experiences. And it was a way for them to be together again, so, yeah.
One last question.
Hi. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to just ask a question about your other book, Just Like Us,
Sure.
which I enjoyed so much I read twice.
Oh,
But I just wondered if you stayed in touch with those subjects and if you had anything to say about their lives.
yeah,
A few years
absolutely.
later.
So Just Like Us also has multiple female characters. In that case, 4 young women growing up in Denver. We meet them in high school on the eve of their senior prom, and they're all from families that immigrated from Mexico, but 2 young women have legal status, 2 do not. And their friendships are in a state of conflict because 2 without legal status are jealous of 2 with. 2 with are defensive about their relative privilege compared to the other 2. And I followed them for 6 years through lots of changes. So for people who read the book, everybody else will have to plug your ears because you don't want to know this stuff. Maricela, at the end of the book, she has just gotten married to a U.S. citizen, and they've just had a baby. At the end of the paperback book, there's a little update. And she actually ended up getting very frustrated. She was working as a community organizer and becoming really well known in Denver, and people were trying to hire her for other jobs. And she really wanted to do some of those other jobs, but without legal status, she couldn't. And she got very frustrated, and she had one employer say, if you'll return to Mexico and try to change your status from there, we'll hold this job open for you. So she decided to try. She went back to Mexico. She was hoping that because of her marriage to a U.S. citizen, she might qualify for a waiver to return to the U.S. to await the outcome of her case. So she she applied at a U.S. consulate in Mexico. She got stuck there. Time went by. She was assaulted. Her husband missed her, quit his job, came down to visit her. They ran out of money. He had to leave. The baby was with her. It was incredibly hard year. And then he got a letter saying, your wife has been granted a waiver and can return to the U.S. with provisional legal status, waiting the outcome of her case. So she returned with legal status for the first time in her life, which would allowed her to get her driver's license and to work. And then Yadira, who's the other girl without legal status, after President Obama passed the executive order granting deferred action, so allowing young people brought here at a young age to get work permits and have other minimal rights, Yadira did get deferred action. It's really hard to get. You have to prove that you've been in the United States continuously since your original entry at a young age. You have to prove that you didn't go back to your country of origin and then re-enter as an adult of your own free will. And so if you remember in the book, Yadira's family is the most poor of them all because her mom was single and her dad abandoned them, and they moved a lot. They were homeless for a little while. So Yadira called her mother, who is living in Mexico, and had to leave and go to Mexico, and said, you know, I have to prove I was in the U.S. Did you keep any papers? And her mom said, you know that suitcase I gave to your aunt? Well, in there you're going to find every report card you've ever had, Head Start documents. You're going to find every award you ever got. There's every summer camp you were ever in. Her mom kept every piece of paper because she knew, lacking legal status herself, that documents were really important. So she just kept every single document ever. And so Yadira actually had an excellent case when she went to apply for deferred action, which she got. So all 4 of the young women now have some form of the right to work or quasi-legal status. Deferred action, you know, it's not legal status exactly, but it means you won't get prosecuted right now. So she has that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the chance to talk about this book. I loved being here. Thanks.